What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved comedic geniuses walks into what he thinks is a friendly late-night interview, only to discover the host has prepared an ambush designed to destroy his reputation? What happens when that same host underestimates exactly who he's dealing with and gets completely dismantled on his own show? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most shocking moments in late-night television history, where Jim Carrey turned the tables on Jimmy Kimmel in the most spectacular way imaginable. This is a story about respect, authenticity, and what happens when someone tries to play games with the wrong person. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what your favorite Jim Carrey movie is. Because trust me, after hearing this story, you're going to have even more respect for this comedic legend. The tension was palpable from the moment Jim Carrey walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set. Something felt different about this particular appearance. Kimmel had that look in his eyes, the one that seasoned entertainers recognize immediately. It wasn't the warm, welcoming expression of a host genuinely excited to have a guest. It was calculating, predatory almost, like a shark circling its prey. Jim had been doing press tours for decades. He knew the rhythm of late-night television better than most. The pre-interview chat with producers, the casual banter during commercial breaks, the way hosts would give you a heads up about potentially sensitive topics. But tonight, none of that happened. The producers had been unusually tight-lipped, and Kimmel himself had barely acknowledged Jim's presence backstage. As Jim settled into the guest chair, adjusting his suit jacket and flashing that trademark smile to the audience, he could sense something was brewing. The audience seemed more charged than usual, almost like they were expecting a confrontation rather than entertainment. Kimmel's opening pleasantries felt hollow, lacking the genuine warmth that usually characterized these interactions. "So, Jim," Kimmel began, his voice carrying an edge that made Jim's internal alarm bells start ringing, "I've gotta ask you about something that's been making headlines lately." The way he said it, with that particular pause and emphasis, told Jim everything he needed to know. This wasn't going to be a standard promotional interview. What Kimmel didn't realize was that he was about to engage in a battle of wits with someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of improvisation, someone who could read a room better than most people could read a book, and someone who had zero tolerance for being blindsided by opportunistic hosts looking to create viral moments at his expense. Jim's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. The relaxed, affable guest persona remained intact, but underneath, a master strategist was calculating his next move. He'd been in this business long enough to know when someone was trying to set him up, and he had learned long ago that the best defense was often a spectacular offense. "Oh, you know how headlines can be, Jimmy," Jim replied smoothly, his voice maintaining that friendly tone, while his eyes took on a sharper focus. "They rarely capture the full picture, do they? But I'm always happy to set the record straight. What particular headline has caught your attention?" Kimmel leaned back in his chair, clearly thinking he had the upper hand. He'd done his research, or at least he thought he had. What he failed to understand was that Jim Carrey wasn't just any celebrity guest. This was someone who had built a career on being unpredictable, on thinking 3 steps ahead, and on turning potentially uncomfortable situations into opportunities for brilliance. The audience could feel the shift in energy. What had started as a typical late-night interview was beginning to feel more like a chess match, with two very different players sitting across from each other. Kimmel thought he was playing checkers, but Jim was already several moves ahead in a game of chess that Kimmel didn't even know he was playing. "Well," Kimmel continued, that smirk growing wider, "there's been some talk about your recent comments regarding the entertainment industry, and some people are saying you've become a bit, shall we say, difficult to work with." The question hung, in the air like a challenge, and Jim could see exactly what was happening. This wasn't journalism or entertainment. This was a calculated attempt to create a moment that would generate clicks and controversy. Kimmel was trying to provoke a reaction, hoping to catch Jim off guard, and create one of those viral clips that would dominate social media for weeks. But what Kimmel had failed to account for was that Jim Carrey had been navigating Hollywood, politics, and media manipulation since before Kimmel had even started his career. More importantly, Jim had reached a point in his life where he valued authenticity over diplomacy, and he wasn't about to let some opportunistic host use him as content for cheap entertainment. Jim's smile never wavered, but there was something in his eyes now that should have warned Kimmel to reconsider his approach. Instead of the defensive reaction Kimmel was clearly hoping for, Jim leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone that was somehow both gentle and absolutely devastating. "You know, Jimmy, that's really interesting that you bring that up," Jim said, his words measured and deliberate. "Because I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to be difficult in this industry. And I've come to realize that sometimes what people call difficult is actually just someone refusing to play along with games that don't serve anyone except the person running the game." The audience was hanging on every word now, sensing that something significant was happening. This wasn't the usual celebrity fluff they were accustomed to. This felt real, raw, and absolutely electric. Kimmel's confidence began to waver as he realized Jim wasn't taking the bait the way he'd expected. The calculated smirk started to fade from his face, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like concern. He clearly prepared for a defensive Jim Carrey, maybe even an angry one, but he hadn't prepared for this version, the one who seemed to be enjoying the challenge while simultaneously dissecting it. "I mean, let's be honest about what's happening here, Jimmy," Jim continued, his voice still maintaining that deceptively casual tone. "You invited me on your show under the pretense of promoting my work, but what you're really doing is trying to create a moment. You want me to get upset, maybe storm off, so you can have your viral clip and your headlines tomorrow." The audience was completely silent now, the kind of silence that only happens when people realize they're witnessing something extraordinary. Even the cameras seemed to be holding their breath, capturing every micro-expression as this verbal chess match unfolded. Kimmel tried to recover, forcing out a laugh that sounded hollow in the suddenly tense studio. "Come on, Jim, I'm just asking the questions that people want answered. That's what we do here." "Is it?" Jim asked, tilting his head with genuine curiosity that somehow felt more dangerous than any anger could have been. "Because I've been on a lot of shows, Jimmy, and I've worked with a lot of hosts. The great ones, the ones who actually care about their guests and their audience. They ask questions that illuminate, that entertain, that add value to people's lives. What you're doing right now isn't journalism, it's not entertainment. It's just exploitation disguised as interviewing." The precision of Jim's words was surgical. He wasn't shouting or losing his temper. Instead, he was calmly and methodically exposing the entire premise of what Kimmel was trying to do, and doing it in a way that made it impossible for Kimmel to deny without looking even worse. "Look," Kimmel said, his voice taking on a defensive edge that betrayed his growing discomfort. "I think you're reading too much into this. I'm just doing my job." "Your job," Jim repeated slowly, as if he was considering the phrase carefully. "You know, that's interesting, because I thought your job was to entertain people, to create moments of joy and connection. But what you're doing right now feels more like tabloid journalism. You're trying to manufacture controversy where none exists, hoping to profit from creating division and drama." The audience was riveted. This wasn't just a celebrity defending himself. This was a masterclass in how to handle media manipulation, delivered by someone who clearly understood the game better than the person trying to play it. Kimmel's producer could be seen in the background making frantic gestures, probably trying to figure out how to salvage what was supposed to be a straightforward ambush interview that had somehow turned into a public relations nightmare for their host. But here's what I find really fascinating, Jimmy, Jim continued, his voice taking on that philosophical tone that his fans knew meant he was about to drop some serious wisdom. You seem to think that because I've chosen to be more selective about the projects I take on, more intentional about how I spend my time and energy, that somehow makes me difficult. But what if it just makes me authentic? The word hung in the air, like a revelation. Jim had just reframed the entire narrative, turning what Kimmel had tried to present as a character flaw into a virtue, and doing it so smoothly that even Kimmel seemed momentarily stunned by the elegance of the move. You see, Jim went on, clearly warming to his theme. I spent decades saying yes to everything, playing along with every game, smiling for every camera, giving every interview the same rehearsed answers. And you know what I discovered? That version of me wasn't serving anyone. Not the audience, not the industry, and certainly not myself. So I made a choice to be more honest, more present, more real. And apparently, that makes some people uncomfortable. The audience was beginning to murmur appreciatively. They could sense that they were watching someone who was not only defending himself brilliantly, but was actually teaching them something profound about authenticity and integrity in the process. Kimmel tried one more time to regain control of the situation. But surely you can understand why some people might see your recent behavior as, well, eccentric. It was a mistake. Jim's eyes lit up with what could only be described as delight. The look of someone who had just been handed the perfect opportunity to make his point even more powerfully. Eccentric, Jim mused, as if he was tasting the word. You know, Jimmy, I think that might be the nicest thing you've said all evening. Because eccentric just means different from what people expect, right? It means not following the prescribed path, not giving the anticipated responses, not playing by rules that were designed to benefit everyone except the person being interviewed. The studio audience was no longer just watching, they were experiencing something transformational. Jim had somehow managed to turn what was supposed to be an attack on his character into a celebration of individuality and authenticity that resonated with everyone in the room. And here's the really beautiful part, Jim continued, his smile now genuine and warm in a way that made Kimmel's earlier smirk look petty by comparison. You thought you were exposing some kind of flaw in me, but what you've actually done is given me the perfect platform to talk about something I'm genuinely passionate about. The importance of being true to yourself, even when it makes other people uncomfortable. Kimmel was now visibly sweating. What had started as his attempt to create a viral moment at Jim's expense had completely backfired. Instead of making Jim look bad, he'd somehow managed to make himself look like exactly the kind of opportunistic host that serious artists had legitimate reasons to avoid. You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy? Jim asked, his voice taking on a note of what seemed like genuine sadness. You're actually a talented guy. You've got timing, you can deliver a joke, you understand comedy. But somewhere along the way, you decided that creating drama was more important than creating art. You chose sensationalism over substance, controversy over connection. The silence in the studio was deafening. Jim's words had cut through all the pretense and laid bare exactly what was happening, and everyone in the room could feel it. Kimmel looked like a man who had brought a knife to a gunfight, completely outmatched and desperately searching for an exit strategy that didn't exist. But Jim wasn't finished. If anything, he was just getting started, and what came next would be remembered as one of the most brilliant takedowns in television history. And that brings me to the real question, Jimmy, Jim said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had just realized he held all the cards. why did you really invite me here tonight? Because it clearly wasn't to have an honest conversation about my work or my perspectives. It wasn't to entertain your audience with genuine humor or insight. You brought me here to be your content, to be the raw material for your viral moment. And that tells me everything I need to know about how you view your guests and your audience. The audience was hanging on every word, and you could feel the energy in the room shifting even more dramatically. What had started as Team Kimmel's home turf was rapidly becoming Team Jim's masterclass in dignity and intelligence. Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. I think you're being a little unfair, Jim. We've had great conversations before. Have we? Jim asked with genuine curiosity. Or have we had transactions? Because there's a difference, Jimmy. A conversation happens between two people who respect each other, who are genuinely interested in what the other person has to say. A transaction happens when one person uses another person to get something they want. The precision of that distinction landed like a thunderbolt. Jim had just articulated something that everyone had felt, but no one had been able to put into words. The difference between authentic human connection and performative media manipulation. You know what's really sad about all this? Jim continued, his voice taking on a tone of almost paternal disappointment. Your audience deserves better. These people came here tonight hoping to be entertained, to laugh, to maybe learn something or feel connected to something larger than themselves. Instead, you tried to turn them into witnesses to what you hoped would be my humiliation. You turned them into participants in your little gotcha game without their consent. The audience was nodding now, many of them looking genuinely moved by Jim's words. He had somehow managed to make them feel seen and respected in a way that their own host clearly hadn't. But here's the beautiful irony, Jim said, his smile returning in full force. By trying to make me look bad, you've actually given me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly what authentic communication looks like. You've shown everyone the difference between someone who's trying to use people and someone who's trying to connect with people. Kimmel was now completely silent, apparently having realized that every word he spoke was only making things worse for him. His face had gone through several shades of red, and the confident smirk that had started the interview was nothing but a memory. And that brings me to my favorite part of this whole situation, Jim continued, clearly enjoying himself now. You thought you were going to expose me as being difficult, or eccentric, or whatever label you were hoping to stick on me. But what you've actually done is expose yourself as someone who doesn't understand the difference between challenging people and attacking people, between holding people accountable and trying to tear people down for entertainment. The studio was electric. Now, this wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a philosophical teaching moment delivered by a master who had turned his opponent's attack into an opportunity for education and elevation. You see, Jimmy, when you're authentic, when you're operating from a place of genuine intention rather than manipulation, you don't have to worry about being exposed because you're not hiding anything. But when your whole approach is based on trying to catch people off guard, trying to create moments at their expense, well, eventually you're going to run into someone who sees right through it. Jim paused for a moment, letting that sink in, his eyes never leaving Kimmel's increasingly uncomfortable face. And that's exactly what happened here tonight. You brought me on your show thinking you could control the narrative, thinking you could push me into a corner and create your viral moment. But what you discovered is that when you try to manipulate someone who values authenticity above all else, you end up revealing more about yourself than about them. The audience erupted in applause, a genuine, sustained ovation that seemed to surprise even Jim. They weren't just clapping for entertainment, they were applauding what felt like a moment of truth, in a medium that too often dealt in manufactured drama and artificial controversy. Jim stood up from his chair, extending his hand to Kimmel with a smile that was somehow both gracious and devastating. "Thank you for this opportunity, Jimmy. This has been one of the most educational interviews I've ever done, and I think your audience learned a lot tonight, too." Kimmel had no choice but to shake Jim's hand, his own smile looking forced and painful as the cameras captured what would become one of the most shared clips in late-night television history. But not for the reasons Kimmel had originally hoped. As Jim walked off the stage, waving to an audience that was still applauding enthusiastically, it was clear that something significant had just happened. This wasn't just a celebrity defending himself from an ambush interview. This was a masterclass in how to maintain dignity and authenticity when someone tries to exploit you for their own gain. The real beauty of what Jim had accomplished wasn't just that he had defended himself brilliantly, it was that he had done it in a way that elevated everyone involved, even Kimmel, by showing them what authentic communication actually looked like. He had turned what was supposed to be a moment of destruction into a moment of education, demonstrating the power of staying true to yourself even when others are playing games. That's the story of how Jim Carrey completely dismantled Jimmy Kimmel on live television, not through anger or retaliation, but through the simple power of authenticity and intelligence. It's a reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with people who try to bring you down is to rise so far above their tactics that you leave them with no choice but to question their own approach. What did you think of Jim's handling of this situation? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think more celebrities should stand up to manipulative interview tactics like this. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from Hollywood.